So, as you know, I have this great interview with Bruce Means, who I interviewed really close after you got back from your trip to Guyana. And since I have a really good in depth interview with Bruce, I did want just to briefly ask you about him. It was apparent from the minute I logged into this Zoom interview with him that this guy was pure legend and one of the most authentic guys I've met. We could have just talked for hours. So you go way back with Bruce. I think you've been on 5 international expeditions with him or something. Wow, right there, cover of National Geographic,
You got to read the story.
Islands in the Sky.
This
So
is the story. This is it. This is 20 years in the making.
20 years in the making.
Check it out, because the fodder, is in there. But yeah, and the reason I'm so proud of that story is because it's my profile of Bruce. He everybody should know who he is and what he has done.
Yeah. So you went to this Tepui, and since we haven't seen the documentary yet, the goal was to get him to the top of this Tepui, where he was going to look and along the sides of it for undiscovered to science species. And sounds like it was quite an adventure from hell and also pretty awesome at the same time.
Yeah, well, Bruce and I, this was our 5th trip together down to the Pacaraima Mountains, and we had previously been to Waiasapu, which is kind of this obscure tepui, in 2012. And at that time, he found this new species, which it wasn't purely his discovery. Some spelunkers had discovered it, and they brought back a specimen, but they didn't preserve it right. And so basically it just kind of fell apart. So it was sort of identified, but they couldn't do any work on its morphology or its DNA because the specimen fell apart.
Was it a frog?
It's a frog. It was a type of frog called the pebble toad. And there's 7 species of pebble toad that are known of, and 6 of them live on individual tepui summits in the Pacaraima Mountains. And they're each named after the mountain. So they live on these little islands in the sky, and only on these islands in the sky and nowhere else. They're all interrelated, but they're individual species. There's only one of the 7 that lives not on a tepui summit, and it lives down in the valley where we were exploring. And so that idea right there is just so fascinating. It's really, sort of a modern day example, at least in terms of the work that Bruce is doing, of what Darwin was doing in the Galapagos Island with the finches, where he was finding these birds on these individual islands that were unique species. And then by sort of studying their morphology and how they're different from their cousins that were on the other islands, he basically figured out the origin of species and the survival of the fittest and all that kind of stuff. Is really, really cool and fascinating. And there's very few things in science that I think that are more relevant and important to humankind than evolution. And the tepuis Bruce has described them as laboratories for evolution. So we did this trip in 2012, but we flew to the top with a helicopter, and there's a sinkhole. There's a 600-foot deep hole inside the top of the mountain. So these mountains are like tabletop mesas. So they have these flat tops, they're plateaus. And inside of this one, there's a 600-foot deep hole with a forest in the bottom. And it's one of my best stories because I brought Bruce down into that hole. And anyway, it was the first expedition that I'd ever done that didn't involve any climbing. I didn't climb anything. All I did was bring an old guy down into a hole and then get him back out. but Bruce found this pebble toad,
Amazing.
and then he fit it into this evolutionary tree that he had been building for pebble toads. And then by studying that, he is learning, things about how evolution works and how it works in particular in the tepuis. So after that trip, he said, hey, this was really cool, but the ultimate would be if we flew into some Amerindian village. There's one called Philippi, which is 60 miles away from the mountain. What if we flew into Philippi and trekked all the way to Waiasapu, and then we climbed the mountain, and along the way we could do this elevational transect where we looked at the biodiversity in all these ecological zones from down on the plains all the way up to this alpine summit. The summit's like 7,000 feet. So thousands and thousands of feet of vertical relief over the course of 60 miles, dugout canoes, 40 miles on foot with no trails,
Damn.
into a valley that nobody had ever been into really before, and then climb the mountain. So, and Bruce is going to be 79 years old and turn 80 on the expedition. So yeah, I could go on and on about this, but people should check out the April issue of National Geographic, because that's where I tell the story. And then this special, which is coming out on Earth Day, which is the film version,
Yep.
his story.
And then so it was you, and you had the awesome filmmaker Renan, Matt Irving, cameraman was there. There's some other crew and locals, and then you had Joe, just another climber with you to do a first ascent on a wall there. Who was that?
We had what I call two ringers.
Yeah.
And everyone knows what a ringer is. And okay, climbing this tepui, this is not a trivial affair. I mean, the cliffs are overhanging, you're talking first ascent. I used to do a lot of that stuff when I was younger. Still pretty keen, but also very concerned about my well-being and safety. So I needed secret weapons, and I brought in a guy named Federico Fuco Pisani, who is one of the world's most experienced tepui climbers, and he's a Venezuelan. I guess he's been on like 20 tepui expeditions, pioneering first ascents on tepuis all over the place, world expert tepui climbing. And Alex Honnold, who I have, history with. We've done expeditions together.
You wrote a book about him.
Yeah, I wrote a book that kind of centered on him climbing El Capitan without a rope. Alex is one of the world's best rock climbers. He can go up anything. So we had him as a secret weapon, and also as kind of a star. And the truth is that kind of thing really helps, when you're trying to tell these stories, when you're trying to get funding, when you're trying to get National Geographic behind it. I want to say that someone at National Geographic might have subtly hinted that Alex would be a great team member for this. And I hit him up, and I mean, he's pretty busy now. The guy's in high demand, and I just kind of laid it out for him. And I'm like, hey, here's Bruce, here's the story, here's the place. And he was kind of non-committal at first, and I kind of figured he's too busy, there's no way he's going to do it. And then I called him back like a month later, and I was like, hey man, what do you think? And he's like, yeah, I'm in.